So the last thing I want to ask you is sort of this idea of extrapolating what we're talking about into broader civil society. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, I think this conversation really comes at an important time in our society, not just as a state, but as a nation, because there is so much consternation and contempt and vitriol and anger towards one side or the other. And so many of the conversations we have here on Defending Ideas are so often about how to restore the muscle memory of what good civic self-government means. And based on what you guys are both saying, I think that seems to be sort of a core aspect of the mission of both the University of Utah and Brigham Young University. And I want to ask you specifically about this idea of, as we alluded to before, sort of the role of faith and pluralism in a public, very pluralistic society. And maybe, President Randall, starting with you, especially when you look at it through the lens of a state university at the University of Utah, what does it look like on campus to accommodate the interests and beliefs of religious students at a place like the U?
We realized very early on, probably because we're founded by the founders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and we're located miles from its headquarters, that many, many of our students wanted to have dialogues about religion. And so we leaned on Eboo Patel, the founder of Interfaith America, to try to help us with our interfaith program. He has been remarkable in terms of training students of how they can dialogue. We'll have nearly 2,000 students trained in dialogue across different religious areas of religious diversity. And that same training around religious differences is also easily applied to any other difference that we might have. And our hope is that we lean into the positiveness that can come from religious belief and faith, because it is fundamentally about hope in future and confidence in our own futures. And if we can do that, it creates a really remarkable environment on a campus where learning becomes at the forefront, and at the same time there is remarkable debate around ideas.
President Reese, a similar question, but for a religious university. How do you prepare students? I guess it could be a similar question based on what President Randall said earlier, that their pluralism still exists on BYU campus. So I guess I'd ask kind of the same question to you, but also with the angle of the students at BYU who are of the faith of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. How do you prepare students to then go out into the world where they may or may not be part of a majority faith? How do they engage in, again, this pluralistic constitutional society that we're in? How do you anchor them for that in the future?
Well, one of the things that we feel super strongly about at BYU is this idea that we have a board of trustees was chaired by the first presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so a big part of our charge as a university is that we help to sort of model, to help teach and train the next generation of people who can actually implement some of the things that say, President Nelson would say. And boy, I cannot think of a more timely message than his call for the world, really, not just members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to be peacemakers. I remember I was in the conference center when he gave that address, and I remember thinking, this is a timely address for the world. And this was really even before some of the vitriol we've seen in recent years. And so we feel it a very significant responsibility as an institution to teach a generation of people who do understand how to have more dialogue rather than just monologue. A group of people who really understand what it is to be peacemakers, obviously not peacemaking at all costs, that we need to be able to have disagreement, but we need to learn how to do that in a more civil way. I certainly have great appreciation for the governor of our state for trying to talk to us about how to disagree better. That these all come at a cost in today's society. But I think it takes courage to have people who are willing to stand up and to say, yeah, we want to be peacemakers, and we want to hold strong to our ideals, And those two things aren't separate from one another, that we can have both of those things. I think at times those get pitted as competing ideals that have to be chosen between, and that there's a balance. But I think what we really need to do as a society is have a better sense about how to live both of those ideals more fully.
Can I expand on that for a minute? Because I think it ties in so much to, honestly, the sort of the mission of this show, of defending ideas, and so much of what we do here at Sutherland Institute. And as you said, President Reese, what Governor Cox has tried to establish through the Disagree Better initiative. And I think just really what our civic culture needs is what you're saying. And as you mentioned, President Nelson of the Church of Jesus Christ, that talk about being peacemakers, I want to ask you both, how do we do that? Because I think of it in terms of, I view universities largely as microcosms of society, right? That people come with all kinds of different experiences and ideas, and there are a lot of differences, but they're there for a shared purpose of, and I wrote down what you guys were saying earlier, this idea of conveying values, very, very much American values, broadly speaking, and sharing knowledge. But there are still differences, and I think back to my time in college with really robust debates, whether it's politics or religion or whatever else, and I love that. I love that kind of constructive, vigorous debate. And so I want to ask you both, from your perspectives, how can all of us do what you're saying, President Reese? Number one, be really good at articulating what I believe and why I believe it's a good thing, and also doing it in such a way that strives to be a peacemaker. That seems really, really hard to balance. Almost none of us get it right. How do we do it?
So the quote I like is from one of our scholars. We have to teach students to be architects of a better system, not arsonists of the current one. We have a set of public impact scholars that come to our university, and they center themselves around a single value. And by the way, we share these scholars back and forth. We get ideas from Brigham Young University, and we get to benefit from the people they invite, and we hopefully they benefit from some of the folks that we invite. But I want to give just a shout out to Tim Shriver. Tim Shriver, of course, leads the Special Olympics movement, and he told a really interesting story, because what he talks about is begin first with showing dignity for others. And he tells a story of the Special Olympics. They had handed out one-use cameras to all of the Special Olympians so that they could take pictures of President Clinton, who was going to be speaking at the opening ceremonies. And when they looked down, all of the athletes were looking through the camera the wrong way. At least that's what they perceived. And all of a sudden they were shocked and scared. They said, "Oh my goodness, that's not the way they should be using those cameras." And a number of the staff ran down and said, No, you've got to turn the cameras around. And the athlete said, "You don't get it. If you look through the cameras the other way, you can see the president better." And they discovered in that moment that if you give someone a moment to explain where they're coming from and give them that dignity, right, we will begin with a foundation of building a better society. And the arsonist suddenly begins to listen. And I think for me, that is the foundation of what we have to provide our students, is a place of dignity where they can disagree and dialogue.
And for us, I'll just say, and I think this is true for most institutions, although they may not be able to articulate as much, the fact that we claim to believe that we are all children of God. And if that is true, it changes the nature of the conversation. It changes how you look at the person across the way from you. And it changes the dignity, really, with which you approach them in these conversations. One of the things I should say right off the top, we're not doing this perfectly or even well yet. We have a lot of work to do on college campuses nationwide, not the least of which is BYU. We were supposed to be the place where these kinds of ideas could be cultivated and explored. And candidly, I don't think we've done a great job at it. And so we have work to do within higher education of trying to be the microcosm that you spoke about.
But we also have to remember that we get a new batch of several thousand students every year, and we actually start that process over again every single year.
Absolutely. So it feels like a moment where we can, in fact, take our place as institutions where this really should be the laboratory for just such communications, just such dialogue, that I think can be a model for society in general. But we got work to do, it feels like.
Agreed.
Last question. We're about at time, but I want to ask you both very briefly. Maybe number one, what's next for both of you universities, for the world of higher ed in general? What needs to happen to achieve that goal, President Reese? And number two, what advice would you give for folks watching or listening out there who hear this and say, this sounds great, but it's really hard to put this into practice? So what's next? Give us some advice or words of encouragement briefly as we wrap up.
Yeah, I'll just take a moment. It was interesting. I was with a gathering of 100 presidents from around the country where we were talking about how do we build trust in higher education. And there was a set of panelists, about 8 panelists, and 7 of the panelists all had something to say that was very similar in spirit. And it was essentially, we need to tell our story better, and we need to tell our story louder. And there was on this panel a sage old chancellor who, after those other panelists had all articulated the same idea in different words, he stood back and he said, I actually think and I mean this as respectfully as I can, that they're absolutely wrong. And I remember the entire room kind of stopped and got silent. And he said, I think what we need is a little more humility. And I think that for us as an institution, how do we build trust in higher education? I think there's some fair criticism of higher education. And I think we need to have a healthy sense of humility as we approach some of where we need to improve, and also what we have to offer, and to be listeners. I actually am bullish on higher education and what it does for civil society. And I think we also have room to grow and to learn and to get better.
President Randall, you have the last word.
I think my thoughts are very similar. When I think about the lack of confidence right now in higher education, I think we've lost alignment with our constituents. And the only way you get that back is by listening and responding. And I would echo what President Reese said. You've got to be humble about it. You've got to recognize that we have some problems that we can correct and we can address. And then as we're doing that, and this is probably, I think, the thing I've learned most as a president, is I have to prioritize relationships over ideologies. I have to care fundamentally about the human being first, and then I can talk ideas with them. I have to care that they need to thrive, and I need to thrive after our interaction is over. And I'm hoping that the University of Utah becomes an institution that drives incredible societal impact in the state, but we start by listening and focusing on relationships with individuals.
Thanks for watching that clip of Defending Ideas. For the full conversation, click the link in the description and make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your shows.